So please join me in welcoming Jeremy Scahill, just an all-around great journalist and all-around great guy. It's really a tremendous honor to be with all of you. I've recognized so many faces. I was just talking to Tom, who is a 30-year veteran, who is now a vet for peace, who was one of the strong voices that we had when we were trying to stop Blackwater from opening up shop first in Potrero, and then when they tried to turn that strip mall into a little paramilitary camp here in San Diego, and so many other people that worked tirelessly, and Ray Lutz, who was just an amazing campaigner to try to shut down Blackwater's presence here in California, and Carol, and all of the folks who are working with the San Diego Peace Center. It's just really great to see all of you here. When I saw the drone when I walked in, I haven't seen this sort of, they don't look like that when you see them in a war zone. They're sort of ominous, and they're high up in the sky, and you hear sort of this sort of hum that almost sounds like a lawnmower or something. So it's, I have to say, it was a little bit creepy for me, and it's very creepy to see myself in the crosshairs there. I don't know if we can turn that off or something. Oh, I thought she was coming up to turn it off. I want to tell folks, I've been traveling in and out of various U.S. war zones, declared and undeclared, pretty much for the past 12 or 13 years. I guess most of my adult life I've spent going in and out of war zones, and I cut my teeth as a, thank you very much. Well, now you have the audience in the crosshairs, so maybe I should take one for the team. You know, I started off, my parents are both nurses, and we never took a trip out of the country at all when I was a kid. Our vacation in the summers would be, we'd go once to like the Six Flags theme park and another to a water park, and we thought we had it made, and we never went anywhere outside of the country. And one of the first trips I took internationally was actually to Iraq, which is, and I did that when I was working with Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! Some friends of my father's were going into Iraq at the time. There was an economic war being waged against Iraq, and this was during the Clinton administration, where you had this incredibly brutal regime of economic sanctions that were strengthening the regime of Saddam Hussein and harming Iraqi civilians. And people forget that Clinton initiated the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam under the guise of the so-called no-fly zones in the north and south of Iraq. And so I went into Saddam Hussein's Iraq with a humanitarian delegation that was trying to break the economic sanctions, and they weren't shipping huge amounts of goods. They were bringing in symbolic items that would dramatize how outrageous the sanctions were. Basic goods like aspirin or other analgesics. Lead pencils were not allowed. Bleach was not allowed because they classified it as dual use. And I'll never forget how profound and profoundly moving the first trip I took to Iraq was, because I had never really done any real reporting. In fact, I don't have a college degree at all. I've never taken a journalism class. I begged my way into a job with Amy Goodman at Democracy Now! I think Amy had to decide at one point. I was calling her and saying, you know, if you have a cat, I'll feed your cat. If you have windows, I'll wash your windows. You know, I'd heard her on the radio. I said, I want to be her. And I started basically to stalk her, and she had to decide whether to get a restraining order against me or to let me come in and volunteer on her show. So I go from then being a coffee runner with Amy to somehow scrounging up enough money from begging people, relatives and others, for cash to go to Iraq, and I end up in Iraq, and I knew very little about US policy there, and I'll never forget being in a hospital in the south of Iraq in Basra and seeing the birth defects that children were suffering from as a result of the depleted uranium munitions that the US used in the 1991 Gulf War, and seeing so many women who were pregnant fearing that their children were going to be born with these horrifying birth defects. And I'll never forget the moment when I was in the delivery room when a child was born and had this gaping hole from his nose to his throat, and the doctor said to us, and these were American-trained, British-trained doctors. Iraq was a very modern society prior to the '91 Gulf War, and they said, you know, we're finding birth defects that don't even exist in medical journals. And I knew when I was there that one of the primary things that I wanted to do with my life, one of the primary missions I wanted to set for myself was to put a microphone in front of the mouths of people who would have no voice if journalists from the United States didn't go there and talk to them and make their stories heard. And I've tried over the years to be a reporter in that spirit, an unembedded journalist who goes and embeds with the civilians who live on the other side of the barrel of the gun, so to speak. And I most recently, the past few years, spent a lot of time in Yemen and Somalia and in Afghanistan. I also was elsewhere in East Africa, exploring the landscape of US wars declared and undeclared. And in Afghanistan, there are two wars. There's the conventional war that we see with the Marines and embedded journalists, and then there's another war buried within it, which is a special operations war of attrition, where you have night raids and hit lists and people being hunted down. And they've killed so far down the kill list over the past decade plus that they're now targeting farmers in valleys who are only fighting the US because we're there. And it's gotten to a point where I don't think that most US military personnel in Afghanistan even understand who the enemy is anymore. And we in the course of reporting on these stories, I traveled with my dear friend Richard Rowley, who is a great independent journalist, and he's an unfamous journalist, but he's this fantastic cameraman and a very brave guy, and we were filming together for 3+ years, and we made a film by the same name called Dirty Wars that premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. And Rick actually won the cinematography prize, which is interesting because it's a prize for the art of a film, and if you see it, it really is remarkable how talented he is. But I found out today that it's actually going to have a theatrical run in San Diego. I think it's going to open June 21st or 28th at the Landmark Theater. They haven't decided on the exact date, but it opens around the country starting June 7th, and I think we're up to about 50 cities, so you can spread the word and tell your friends. I wanted to start off by telling you a story about an incident that happened on December 17th, 2009. This was just a little bit less than a year into the Obama presidency. And President Obama had campaigned, I think many people had the perception that he was the anti-war candidate, but if you actually paid attention to his platform and you looked at who he chose as his advisors around him, particularly on national security and counterterrorism issues, he was charting out or staking out a fairly hawkish foreign policy position. He pledged to surge in Afghanistan. He said he was going to take the fight to Al-Qaeda, and he, in one of the sharpest exchanges with John McCain, said that he would actually violate the sovereignty of nations if we had, and the specific example he gave was if we know where Osama bin Laden is, he said we would go into Pakistan with or without the support of the Pakistani government. He also pledged to close Guantanamo, which of course still remains one of the great stains on the fabric of our democratic republic. The fact that there are hunger strikers there now, the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are now signing on to these petitions, I think we have a moment where we actually can push hard on that issue because it should have been closed long ago. And it's not just because the Republicans have blocked it in Congress, though that is part of it. It's also because the Obama administration hasn't fought hard enough on this issue, haven't made it enough of a priority. When Democrats were threatening to dissent early on in the Obama presidency from his defense authorization, and people like Dennis Kucinich and Jan Schakowsky and others began to dissent, many of them were pressured by the White House. Freshman congresspeople were threatened with the president not campaigning for their reelection if they didn't flip and vote in favor of these defense bills. If Obama showed that same kind of resolve on the Guantanamo issue and actually made the stakes that high for people in his own party in particular, I believe that they would have shut down Guantanamo. So for the first 10, 11 months of the Obama presidency, I think it was pretty clear what direction we were headed in. He issued executive orders saying he was going to dismantle the black sites, these CIA prisons that had been set up in Thailand and Poland and elsewhere around the world. He said he was going to close Guantanamo, and he said he was going to bring an end to torture. And that all played out in public, but behind the scenes, President Obama was listening to some very powerful figures from the covert apparatus that permeates the shadows of America's foreign policy. And those were people like General Stanley McChrystal and Admiral William McRaven. General McChrystal ran the Joint Special Operations Command from 2003 to 2008 and was essentially running a global hit team that did not function within the normal chain of command of the military, often reported directly back to Vice President Dick Cheney, and they were doing things far outside of the lens or scope of congressional oversight or any effective congressional oversight. And Admiral William McRaven, who was McChrystal's deputy, was a man who very early on after 9/11 helped the National Security Council to develop the concept of a kill list. He would then go on to run the hunt for the people on that list under the Obama presidency. And so these individuals, General McChrystal, Admiral McRaven, and others, began agitating for President Obama to expand the battlefield. They wanted to take a military doctrine, which is known as operational preparation of the battle space, which essentially dictates that if the US military determines that there are future hostility possibilities in a nation, that you can forward deploy troops and you can begin to prepare the way for a full-on onslaught of the US military. Well, that military doctrine was repeatedly used through the Bush era to justify acting in countries without the knowledge of Congress and without any sort of declaration of war. And early on in his presidency, Obama started to issue execute orders that gave permission to US Special Operations Forces to begin striking in countries outside of Iraq and Afghanistan and to intensify its operations, particularly in the Horn of Africa and on the Arabian Peninsula. And on this particular day, December 17th, 2009, President Obama was presented with a series of baseball cards that had the identities of individuals on them and sort of their stats, like you would have stats for a pitcher or a cleanup hitter. And the individuals that were on that card, the president were told, were dangerous leaders of Al-Qaeda and they needed to be taken out, and that all of them were residing in Yemen. And that one of them had actually been tracked to this village called Al-Majla, which is in Abyan province. I don't think anyone in the White House had ever heard of Al-Majla. Most Yemenis had never heard of Al-Majla. And they told the president that they had this solid information that a man named Mohammed al-Kazmi was there, that he was a dyed-in-the-wool jihadist, and that he was a leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They also told the president that there was an Al-Qaeda training camp there and that they had huge stores for ammunition and rockets and other weapons. And based on that intelligence, the president and his advisors signed off on a strike against Al-Majla. And they wanted to use drones. And remember that already the president was intensifying the drone war in Pakistan. On his third day in office, he ordered his first drone strike, and it ended up hitting a civilian procession, and the person that they claimed was there wasn't there. So that was on day 3 of the presidency. Drone bomb every 3 days for that first year in Pakistan. He wanted to use a drone to do this strike against Al-Majla because the firepower in the drones is not as potent as some of the other military platforms. But they couldn't find any drones that were available because they were all being used to bomb Pakistan. And so they authorized a cruise missile strike from a submarine that was in the ocean just off of the coast of Yemen. And a Tomahawk cruise missile is an utterly devastating weapon. I've seen the effect of it, the impact of it when it's on the ground, but they also were using cluster bombs, which are like flying landmines. The first time I saw the impact of a cluster bomb was in 1999 in Yugoslavia, when a marketplace in the city of Niš was bombed. And I went there a few hours after it, and I remember as we started to drive up to that marketplace, I was shocked at how the shrapnel was so sharp and moving at such a fierce velocity that it had actually it had fossilized the impact of a bomb in the cement. It looked like splashed water, except it was indented in the cement. And then when we got to the marketplace in Niš, we saw what I can only describe as shredded meat. And there had been people that had been there. And I believe, as if I recall correctly, that marketplace was bombed not long after noon, when people were going out to buy greens or what have you. And so this was the platform that they chose to bomb this, what they said was an Al-Qaeda training camp. And you know, cluster bombs come down and they detonate in the air and they spread shrapnel over a multi-football field radius. And it is utterly horrifying what it does when it hits animals or human beings. And the strike happens, and they all believe in the White House that what they've done is taken out an Al-Qaeda training camp. And the next day, the Yemeni embassy in Washington, D.C. issues a press release. And they say that they have conducted air raids on this terrorist camp in Al-Majla with Yemeni aircraft, and that they had taken out the terrorist training camp. And then the White House sent congratulations to the Yemeni government on this victory against Al-Qaeda. And no one would have been the wiser that it was not a Yemeni strike, and it was, in fact, a US cruise missile strike, if a brave young Yemeni journalist named Abdullah Haider Shaya hadn't traveled to Al-Majla in the aftermath of that strike. And he traveled there because he had received phone calls from tribal leaders in the area that were describing seeing the markings made in the USA on the missile parts. And they wanted him to come and videotape it. And no one had seen any airplanes fly overhead, just missiles slamming in. And the missiles hit a little bit after 6 a.m. Most of the people were sleeping in this village. And so this journalist, Abdullah Haider Shaya, goes to Al-Majla. And he takes photographs and video of the aftermath of this bombing. And he sent those photographs to various news agencies around the world. And he also provided them to Amnesty International. And Amnesty International had a munitions expert look at the pictures that Abdullah Haider Shaya had given them, and they determined beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were in fact cruise missiles and cluster bombs. And the Amnesty International noted that cluster bombs are illegal under international weapons conventions. And so he started reporting on this story, and he went on Al Jazeera, and he said that the Americans were the ones that bombed Al-Majla, and that among the dead were 14 women and 21 children. And he had photos of dead children, of babies being pulled out of rubble, of body parts of women, of little girls who part of their body was here and part was there. And he had evidence of it, and he started speaking to not only Al Jazeera, but other international news outlets. And then the story started to come out in the press, because remember, the last time the US bombed Yemen was in 2002, and it was a one-time thing authorized by Bush. It was a drone strike in 2002. But there was no declared war in Yemen, and it came completely out of the blue. And so it was at that moment that we knew that the United States was initiating a bombing campaign against Yemen. And soon after Abdullah Haider Shaya blew the whistle on the cruise missile attack at Al-Majla, he was abducted off the streets as he was going into the market with a friend of his who was a political cartoonist, and both of them were snatched by the US-backed counterterrorism force in Yemen. These are Yemenis that are trained and funded by the US. And he was taken to a political prison and savagely beaten in that prison, beaten bloody. And they told him, "You are to shut your mouth about Al-Majla, or we're going to put you back in this prison." And they release him onto the streets, and he goes immediately to the studios of Al Jazeera, and he says, "I was just abducted by the US-backed counterterrorism unit, and they are threatening me that if I don't stop talking about Al-Majla, that they're going to put me back into that prison." So while this journalist is continuing to report the story, General David Petraeus, who at the time was the commander of CENTCOM, US Central Command, arrives in Sana'a for meetings with the country's leadership. And we know about these meetings because of Bradley Manning leaking the cables to WikiLeaks, and then those being published around the world. And in this meeting with General Petraeus and the US-backed dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh and the Deputy Prime Minister Rashid Alimi in Yemen, according to the cable, the Deputy Prime Minister of Yemen tells Petraeus, "I just lied to my parliament and told them that it was us doing the bombing." And they said, "We'll continue to lie for you and say the bombs are ours and not yours." And they were conspiring to initiate a bombing campaign where Yemen would take responsibility for the strikes, but the United States would be conducting the strikes. And soon after this began to be exposed to the world, Abdullah Haider Shaya was arrested once again, was disappeared for 30 days, was held in the Political Security Organization's prison, and then he was hauled into court in a cage. And he had the lawyers that showed up that day from the equivalent of the ACLU said that they would refuse to present a defense in his case because it's not a legitimate tribunal. He was being prosecuted in a court that had been set up specifically to try journalists who had committed crimes against the US-backed dictatorship, thought crimes against them. Cartoonists would be in there for drawing political cartoons that were offensive to the regime. Writers who had interviewed someone from Al-Qaeda could find themselves in there. And so Abdullah al-Haider Shaya is hauled into court. One of his teeth is broken, another one had been pulled out. He had scars on his chest. And he appears in this cage and he addresses, there were some journalists in the room and there were some lawyers and his family were there, and he said, this is what happens when a journalist tells the truth in Yemen. When you expose the American cruise missile bombing of the tiny Bedouin village of Al-Majla, this is what they do to you, and then they pull him away, and we have the video of that, and they pull him away. And there was so much outcry in Yemen over the imprisonment of Abdullah al-Haider Shaya and the ultimate conviction of Abdullah al-Haider Shaya for terrorism. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an Al-Qaeda facilitator. Every major media rights and human rights organization in the world condemned his trial as a sham, and they said that he should be released. The government had fabricated evidence against him, and they didn't call a single witness. And so he's sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an Al-Qaeda facilitator. And while he's in prison, posters started to appear around Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, with his picture on it, demanding his return, demanding his release. And his tribe and other tribes began to put pressure on the Yemeni government. And they said, we want Abdullah al-Haider Shaya freed. You can't keep him in there on these trumped-up charges. And the pressure was so intense from human rights groups, international and domestic and tribal leaders in Yemen, that the US-backed dictator decides that he's going to pardon Abdullah al-Haider Shaya. And he's preparing a document that's going to grant him a sort of amnesty. And it leaks in the Saba news agency, Yemen's official news agency, that the dictator of Yemen is going to do this. And that day, he receives a phone call. The president of Yemen receives a phone call from the White House. Not from some flaky, not from the White House spokesperson or some deputy secretary of who knows what, but from President Obama himself. And President Obama says to Ali Abdullah Saleh that the United States has serious concerns about word that you're going to release Abdullah al-Haider Shaya, and the pardon was ripped up. And he remains in prison to this day. He remains in prison to this day. And I just got an email from his brother the other day, and he told me that his cell regularly gets tossed by operatives of the political security organization. They take his things away from him. Anytime someone brings him something, they snatch it away. After he's gotten used to having a new book, they take it away. And his brother said he's starting to lose his mind. He's starting to talk to himself. This was a guy who was a heroic journalist. And he did work not just for Al Jazeera, he did work for the Washington Post. He did work for ABC News. When I first reported on his story, there hadn't been any articles done about it. And I started to understand this was a guy who had interviewed leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and his interviews were published on the front pages of major US newspapers as scoops. And I couldn't understand why none of those newspapers, or why ABC News never said, free Abdullah al-Haider Shaya, free our colleague. Because when they wanted the scoop on an Al-Qaeda exclusive interview with an Al-Qaeda leader, they were more than happy to recognize that he was a journalist. But when he's in prison, they say nothing. And so I asked a very famous journalist from one of those news organizations, why are you silent about the imprisonment of Abdullah al-Haider Shaya? And a few days later, he got back to me and he said, we were told by the US government that the money we were paying him was being used as fundraising for Al-Qaeda, which is an outrageous, false allegation. I'm sure they were paying him pennies to do the risky work that he was doing. But the US government is smearing him to these organizations and saying he's a terrorist. His work is well known by anyone who covers Yemen and anyone who knows the politics of Yemen, because he's one of the few real journalists in a society dominated by regime sycophants. He was one of the only people that reported critically about Al-Qaeda after having met them in face-to-face. He was a courageous young man, and he's in prison to this day for actually being a journalist, and he's in prison on orders of the most powerful man in the world. Our Constitution law professor, Nobel Peace Prize president is keeping a journalist in prison in a gulag in Yemen because he had the audacity to blow the whistle on a bombing that they tried to cover up, that killed 14 women and 21 children. The very, very last line of my book, at the very end of my acknowledgments, says that as of this writing, Abdullah al-Haider Shaya is still in prison and he should be set free. And he should be set free. Soon after that strike that I told you about, the reporting about which got Abdullah Haider Shaya in prison, was the first strike in Yemen, as I said, in over 7 years. And it was followed up immediately by a series of a half a dozen or so strikes. And then throughout 2010 and 2011 and 2012 and 2013, the Obama administration has bombed Yemen. I went to Abyan province, where Majula is. I went there over a year after the missile had hit, and I interviewed survivors of that strike. And when we were there, more than a year later, you still could see the cruise missile parts in that village that were manufactured by General Dynamics and said, made in the USA on them. And we have that video that was taken not a week after, but more than a year after. It's still there. There are unexploded cluster bombs that are still peppering the countryside in Yemen. In fact, 2 days after that strike, some children were playing with one and they were blown up to pieces because they're colorful and they're yellow, and kids thought that they were a toy, and they picked them up and they were blown to pieces. When I got the list leaked to me by that was the investigation of the Yemeni parliament, which is a pro-US entity. These tribal leaders have gone there, these parliamentarians. I have a list of the name of every single person killed at Al-Majla. 46 people were killed. And I went down and counted them, and 14 were women and 21 were children. And the guy that they said that they were trying to kill, Mohammed al-Kazmi, they killed him. I investigated, who is this guy? He's a nobody. People in Yemen know him. He's a legendary mujahideen who had fought in Afghanistan. Yeah, he had said some stuff in support of Al-Qaeda. He was an old man, an old-timer. He wasn't a player in Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Why is it that the most powerful nation on earth rained cluster bombs and cruise missiles down on a poor Bedouin village to kill one guy who everyone says is just an old retired mujahideen that fought actually on the US side in Afghanistan? Was it that the US was fed bad intelligence by the regime in Yemen? There was pressure to do something about Al-Qaeda, so they said, no one's going to care about this village. This is in the middle of nowhere. No running water, they're Bedouins, they're nomadic. No one will know the difference between a tiny Bedouin village and an Al-Qaeda camp because no one's ever going to go there. That was the part that they didn't factor in, that someone actually would care enough to go there and look at it. And that person, that someone, is in prison right now. And so after they did Al-Majla and they covered it up and they said Yemen did it, then they start bombing again. And on December 24th, 2009, they did another strike in a province called Shabwa province, and one of the people that they claimed to have killed in that strike was an American citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki, December 24th, 2009. Now, Anwar al-Awlaki, I knew his name going back to 2001 when I was a radio producer. I remember trying to book Anwar al-Awlaki on our show. Because Anwar al-Awlaki, you may have seen, many of you probably know who he is or heard his name. You've probably seen him on YouTube videos where he's wearing a camouflage jacket in front of the black flag, and he's calling for jihad against the United States, armed jihad against the United States. And he's calling on young Muslims to either conduct attacks in their own countries or come to the fronts of jihad in Afghanistan or Yemen or elsewhere. And there's a whole string of speeches that you can watch of Anwar al-Awlaki's that you will have almost no choice but to conclude that he was reprehensible. One of the things he did that I think was just unconscionable is that he published an article calling for the assassination of cartoonists that had drawn derogatory, demeaning pictures of the Prophet Muhammad. I think it was stupid for them to draw those pictures of the Prophet Muhammad, but I certainly don't think that you then say, I'm offended by this, you should kill this person. He called for the assassination of specific cartoonists, including a young woman in Seattle, Washington named Molly Norris, who had to change her name and go into witness relocation because Anwar al-Awlaki had called for her to be assassinated and published a hit list. Al-Awlaki praised the shooting of soldiers in Fort Hood, Texas by Nidal Hassan in November of 2009. The next day he wrote a blog post that said Nidal Hassan was a hero. He also praised the attempted downing of an airplane over Detroit on December 25th, 2009, the so-called underwear bomb plot. This deranged young Nigerian guy named Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib. And there have been leaks in the US press that al-Awlaki was operationally involved in planning that attack, and that he had directed Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib to try to bring down that airplane. Maybe he did. But we haven't seen any evidence publicly presented to suggest that that's the case. And if we're going to start assassinating US citizens, on the basis of leaks and not hard evidence, and we're not going to give them a chance to respond to charges against them, and not even charge them with a crime, then we should stop saying that we're the country that we are and rewrite our Constitution and say that for some people, we're not going to offer them any kind of right to due process. Because I believe firmly that a society is judged or should be valued based on how it treats the least of its people, how it treats the poor, how it treats the disempowered, but also how it treats the most reprehensible of its citizens. The story of Anwar al-Awlaki isn't so much about who he is as about who we are. If we wanted to make the standard how we treat the popular and the powerful and the rich, ooh, we're so morally bankrupt to the core. It's when you're challenged, when your democracy is challenged, that you rise up and say, this is who we are as a people. And so the case of Anwar al-Awlaki for me was the crossing of a line that is going to be very difficult to walk back from. I remember him in a different way than the camouflage jacket and saying the things that I found despicable and disgusting. I remember seeing him on television after 9/11. I was a radio producer trying to book him, and I remember him on NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. I remember him being on Talk of the Nation with Ray Suarez on NPR. I remember the Washington Post doing a profile about him. And they played these clips of Anwar al-Awlaki. He was an imam at a big mosque in Falls Church, Virginia. He's an American citizen who was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico. His father was a Fulbright scholar here in 1966. He's the imam at this big mosque after 9/11. And he was saying something that I think resonated with a lot of people, that we want justice for what happened on 9/11, and we want the perpetrators brought to justice. And he even said at one point that he believed that the United States had the right to go and hunt down and take out the people that were responsible for 9/11. But he also said, just because the United States has killed so many people in Iraq through the 90s with economic sanctions and the no-fly zones bombing, does not justify the killing of one US civilian in New York or Washington, D.C. It's a direct quote. And he was this guy who became a media celebrity. Why? Because he was caught between two worlds. On the one hand, he was horrified and outraged and condemned what happened on 9/11. And on the other hand, he was saying, don't declare war on the Islamic world. Don't start a witch hunt against Muslims. The day after 9/11, a woman stumbled into his mosque after being beaten with a baseball bat. He watched as Muslims were being rounded up and targeted, and as Guantanamo then was opened and people started getting abducted and brought to Guantanamo and put in orange jumpsuits. And he was being harassed by the FBI behind the scenes, and he eventually decided to leave Yemen. And I tell the whole story of many generations of that family in my book, so I won't go into every detail of it. If you're interested, you can look at it. But I will say this, that he is a product of US foreign policy. He was radicalized by the US wars, by the war in Iraq, by seeing the photos that emerged from Abu Ghraib, by the despicable stain that is Guantanamo, by the posturing against the Muslim world and Bush calling it a crusade. And he starts to become more and more sharp and radical in his critique of American foreign policy. And he starts to celebrate the victory of militant movements around the world. When the CIA's warlords were overthrown in Somalia in late 2006, he sent congratulations to them and said that it's like the Taliban government, that this is a great victory for Islam. He began to celebrate attacks against US troops, and he would record these sermons and he would post them around the world, online, so that they could go around the world, and people would make tapes of them. And his tapes start popping up in terror investigations, and people are saying al-Awlaki is inspiring lone wolf terrorists who want to kill Americans or kill Brits, and all around the world his sermons are popping up in these investigations. But it was all speech. It was all speech. And so al-Awlaki is becoming more and more popular from an increasingly disaffected young Muslim population around the world. And he is living with his family in Sana'a, Yemen, where his father was a government minister. And he has 3 children. The eldest was named Abdul Rahman, who was born in Denver, Colorado. And they're living there when he's arrested one day on trumped-up charges of intervening in a tribal dispute. He's put in prison in Sana'a for 18 months without any real charge. The UN investigated it. They said it was an extra-legal detention of Anwar al-Awlaki. He's in solitary for 17 months. He's questioned by the FBI in this prison in Yemen. And he believed firmly that he was in that prison because the US was trying to silence him. What I discovered in reporting this book was that there was a meeting that took place when al-Awlaki was put into prison, that took place in Washington, D.C., between Bandar Bush, a powerful Saudi diplomat who's called Bandar Bush because he's so close to the Bush family, and Yemen's ambassador to the United States, and then a man named John Negroponte, who at the time was the director of national intelligence. And what I understand from people who were privy to that meeting, not John Negroponte, is that Negroponte said, we want al-Awlaki kept in prison for 4 or 5 years so that people forget about him. We want him to go away. So he was being kept in prison because of his words and because the US wanted him to go away. While he's in that prison, his family, which is a very powerful family in Yemen, and their tribe, just like when Abdullah Haider Shaya was taken, the journalist, they go and they say, you cannot keep our son, as they called him collectively, in prison without evidence, without charges. If you show us evidence that he's complicit in any crime, the leader of the Al-Awlaq tribe told the president of Yemen, we'll execute him ourselves. But if you don't have evidence, you have to release him. And the president of Yemen said, well, yeah, we don't have any evidence. The Americans just want him to stay there. And eventually they had to release him. So they release Anwar al-Awlaki, and al-Awlaki starts this blog called Imam Anwar's blog, and the internet became his mosque. And he becomes sharper and sharper. He emerged from prison a changed man. I read his prison writings. They're fascinating. They limited the amount of literature that he could have. I mean, he was given a Quran. They gave him Shakespeare. He hated Shakespeare. Thought Shakespeare was sort of imperialist literature, wanted nothing to do with Shakespeare. But he adored Dickens. And he would compare figures in the US and Yemeni government to like Uriah Heep and other characters. And he would do food reviews, but he also about the hard bread called kudum, and just talking about how you could hammer a nail with it. But he also was becoming much, much sharper. And so when he comes out, he starts this blog, and there's all this pressure on the Yemeni government to rearrest him. And in the beginning of 2009, he decides that he's going to go underground. And he's going to move to the hinterlands of Yemen because he doesn't want to be harassed every day by the Americans and their agents in the capital of Yemen. So he goes down there. And then his father is approached by the head of Yemen's intelligence service. And this guy says to him in May of 2009, if you don't convince your son to come back to Yemen, the Americans say they're going to kill him with a drone. And at this point, there was no Nidal Hassan shooting up Fort Hood yet. There was no underwear bomb plot. There was no video of al-Awlaki in a camouflage jacket calling for armed jihad. There was a guy who had a very, very radical take on US foreign policy, whose rhetoric I didn't agree with. Some of it sounded very much like anti-war rhetoric, and some of it was way off the charts, but all of it was protected speech. And the United States decides that his speech was so dangerous and could potentially cause lone wolf acts of terrorists to be inspired, not directed, but inspired to commit acts of terrorism, that they said he's either in prison or we're going to kill him with a drone, May of 2009. So his father goes down to meet him in Shabwa province, where they're from. And he says, Anwar, the Americans are going to kill you if you don't come back. And he says to his father, how dare you? Are you an agent for the Americans now? You're going to have the Americans tell me which way to position, this is the phrase he used, which way to position my bed when I sleep at night. I was born free and I'll die free. And with that, he told his father to get lost. And that was the last time that his father spoke to him. And his father is a sort of extraordinary man who was a Fulbright scholar here, came to America with these dreams of raising his children in the spirit of American democracy. And I read all of his essays as a young student when he first came to the US in '66. And for him, it was so unthinkable that this was happening to his son because he didn't raise him that way. He didn't raise him to be the guy in the camouflage jacket. And I think he still believed in America. And he said, Anwar, we can resolve this. And Anwar said, they're telling you they're going to kill me. I want nothing to do with them. And so al-Awlaki goes full-blown underground. And then the Nidal Hassan shooting happens. And then the underwear bomber happens. And then al-Awlaki is praising these actions and calling for people to do more. And so the Obama administration creates a task force set up explicitly to hunt down and kill Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen. And we learned that Anwar al-Awlaki was on the kill list in January of 2010 because the Washington Post put it on the front page. And they discovered that there were 3 Americans on the kill list. And among them was Anwar al-Awlaki. And by my count, the Obama administration tried to kill him about a dozen times. There aren't many funny moments in my book, but there are some insane stories that took place when the US was trying to find al-Awlaki, and I'll just share 2 extraordinary ones with you. One is that Anwar al-Awlaki's other siblings are not like him at all. One of them is a beekeeper who makes delicious honey, and he's a wonderful guy, and he looks exactly like his brother. And when I went into their courtyard, I thought Anwar al-Awlaki is like not underground, he's making honey in Yemen. But anyway, so he's this wonderful, quiet, spiritual guy who makes organic honey, and he's an amazing guy. And then the youngest brother, named Ammar, works for an oil company and has like slicked back hair and Armani glasses, and he wears jeans and drives around in an SUV, and he likes to go to Europe. And so he works for this Austrian oil company, and in February of 2011, and I know all of these members of the family, and the Awlakis also, just so you understand where I'm coming from, allowed me to speak to all members of their family. I was allowed to interview all of the women in the family and to spend time with them. I spent an entire Ramadan with that family. And I got to talk to Anwar al-Awlaki's sister, who's a school teacher in Yemen, and to his mother, who got her GED in the United States and worked in a candy factory while her husband was getting his master's degree. And I really got to know this family, and I like them very much and think that they're upstanding people, which is why this story is so hard to tell. And so Ammar, who basically didn't know his brother at all because of the age difference, is in Vienna for business. And in February of 2011, the US has already tried to kill his brother multiple times. And he had gone out for schnitzel with a colleague, and he comes back to the hotel, and he's up in his room, and he gets a phone call from someone saying, my wife and your wife are friends, and I wanted to drop off a gift for your wife from my wife. Can you come down to the lobby? So he comes down to the lobby. And there's this white guy in a crisp blue suit standing there, and the guy, they greet each other, and he says, I don't actually know you or your wife, and my wife doesn't know your wife, and I don't have a gift for you. And he says, my name is Chris, and Ammar says to him, was that your name yesterday? And they kind of have a laugh, and he says, I assume you know what we're here to talk about, and he said, yeah, my brother. And he says, Ammar says to him, are you FBI or CIA? And he goes over the second one, and he said, well, can I see a card? And he goes, well, we're not like the FBI, we don't have business cards. So he showed him a diplomatic passport. And they sit down, and he says, we are going to either kill or capture your brother, and at this point it looks like we're going to kill him unless we can find a way for him to surrender. And he offers Anwar al-Awlaki $5 million to give up the location of his brother. And Ammar didn't know the location of his brother at the time and hadn't seen him since 2004, but he's in this meeting with these guys, and he's saying, I don't know where he is, and they're pressuring him, and he says, I'll take a lie detector test, and they say, well, we have something better than that, and they bring over this like Blackwater type guy, this guy who was like apparently out of Central Casting. He was wearing one of those awful vests that Americans like to wear when they go on vacation, with the white socks and the Tevas. Sorry if anyone's rocking that one. But he's got the vest, and he's got the wraparound sunglasses, and he comes up to them and he says, well, this is a human lie detector. And so they talk, and then they give him a Hotmail account, not even a US government account, and say they're going to be in touch. So while this is all going on, this guy named Morton Storm, who was a friend of al-Awlaki's in the earlier 2000s in Yemen when he was studying Arabic and was kind of an aspiring jihadist, sees that al-Awlaki is sort of in the news and that people are trying to kill him. And this guy he's Danish, and so he goes to the PET, the Danish intelligence service, and he says, I think I can help you find Anwar al-Awlaki. And so the Danish intelligence service tells the CIA, we have a guy that knows al-Awlaki, and so he starts this email communication with Anwar al-Awlaki on encrypted emails. And says to al-Awlaki, I want to help you find a wife to be with you underground because your wife is in Sana'a with your parents. And al-Awlaki says, oh, that would be good. I'd prefer to have like a convert and a European wife. Like he wanted her to be a convert, he wanted her to be, I know you can't make it up, European. So they actually put an ad on Facebook for a wife. This is all a CIA plot. They go on Facebook to put, find a wife. It's the CIA dating service. They find a wife for Anwar al-Awlaki, and women from all over the world start responding and sending in videos, and it was like sort of jihadi OK Cupid or something. It was really strange. And so this woman from Croatia, who was originally a Catholic who converted to Islam and took the name Amina, is chosen by this guy Morton Storm, which is also, you can't make that up. As sort of the one, and she records a video, and we have all of it, we have these videos and the emails, a video for al-Awlaki and sends him this video, and then he sends another video to her back, and he determines that, he says something to her like, you have to be able to live on the run with very little access to like toiletries and things, and living in a tent, and changing locations all the time, just what every woman wants. And so they decide that they're going to get married, and so Morton Storm flies Amina to Austria, where she's then going to get on a plane and fly to Sana'a, Yemen, to go and marry Anwar al-Awlaki. And she has no idea that the CIA is involved with this at all. No, none whatsoever. And so Morton Storm, by the way, this is sort of a sidebar to this. Morton Storm is paid I think it was $250,000, and he was given this briefcase by the CIA and Danish intelligence, and it has a code lock on it. And he said, what's the code? And they said, try 007. I mean, this is how cheesy these people are. Try 007. So he's got his 007 briefcase. He's got Amina from Croatia, who's going to go and marry Anwar al-Awlaki. And the sort of like cherry on top of this whole thing is that they give her this Gucci luggage with tracking devices in it as like a gift. And they say, just tell her it's a gift from you, Morton. And so he gives her this CIA luggage. And so she packs her things, and then she flies to Sana'a, and the CIA is thinking, great, we are going to be led directly to Anwar al-Awlaki by our Gucci luggage that Amina is carrying. So she arrives there, and she meets al-Awlaki's cohort, and these guys say to her, ditch the Gucci, new clothes for you, no jewelry, everything is gone, you have a new life. So they leave the CIA's luggage in Sana'a, and she disappears and marries Anwar al-Awlaki and has a child with him. So the CIA found a bride for Anwar al-Awlaki and facilitated him having another child while underground and being hunted by the most intelligent intelligence service in the world. That's pretty much the end of any funny story I have to tell you tonight. So while al-Awlaki is starting this new family, his original family is living in Sana'a, and they're trying to hunt him down. And in May of 2011, the US very nearly kills Anwar al-Awlaki. They found him in a village in Shebwa. He's driving in a truck, and the US deploys Predator drones and a Global Hawk surveillance. I understand that the Predators are made here in San Diego, as is the Global Hawk. So when we hear this story, remember there's a very serious local connection to the drone program. I'm sure many of you know that. So in May of 2011, they find al-Awlaki, they've got these drones, and they launch a missile at his truck, and it misfires, and it hits nearby, causes the vehicle to blow forward, and it blows out the back window of it. And al-Awlaki and those guys don't know that it's a drone that's going after them. They thought maybe they were being ambushed and it was an RPG or something. So they're speeding away they're trying to speed away. Another drone comes around, fires a payload, misses again. They're in this huge dust up, and they call for backup, and these two brothers, the Harad brothers, come, and they go to bail al-Awlaki out. They drive there, and they're in this huge smoke storm. And I talked to a JSOC guy, a Joint Special Operations Command guy who was working the operation that night. And he said that the satellite, when they were looking at it, they couldn't see anything under it. It was just like ants, and then all of a sudden it was, because it's just two-dimensional imagery, there was just this big cloud. So this car pulls into the smoke. They only have one more missile left on one of the aircraft, and they're waiting to see what's going to happen. Al-Awlaki switches vehicles with these guys, and he drives one way and they drive the other. And so the US operation planners had to decide which vehicle to hit. And they blow up the original vehicle, and Anwar al-Awlaki watches as they blow up these two guys that got into his vehicle, and he had gotten into theirs. And he survived that night and actually wrote an essay about surviving that night. And he managed to make it to the home of this other imam in Yemen. And he said, tonight 11 missiles missed their target, but the next one may hit. And so that incident made the newspapers, and we knew that the US was getting very close to hitting Anwar al-Awlaki. And in fact, that was just 3 days after Osama bin Laden had been killed. The US was trying to run the deck and take out all of these high-value people to try to make May 2011 this sort of epic moment where they decapitated the various al-Qaeda organizations. And so while the news reports come out that Anwar al-Awlaki has been, they first said he had been killed, then everybody realized that he was alive. His eldest son, Abdul Rahman, who was born in Denver, Colorado in '95, had turned 16 the next month in August, and he was really missing his father, hadn't seen him in years, and decided that he wanted to go and try to find his dad. And he, very early one morning, went into his mother's bedroom, and he stole the equivalent of about $40 from her purse in Yemeni riyals, and he left her a small note that said that apologized for stealing the money and saying that he'd pay it back. And that he misses his father and that he wants to go and try to find him. And he packs a small bag and he climbs out the kitchen window and he goes to Bab el-Yemen in the old city in Sana'a, and he boards a bus to go to Shebwa, the site of repeated strikes against his dad. Well, it turns out his dad wasn't even in Shebwa, so he arrives there and staying with family in this province. And while he is there waiting, his father is killed in this drone strike on September 30th, 2011. And his father was killed with another American citizen named Samir Khan, who's widely believed to be the editor-in-chief of Inspire magazine, the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula publication. And I know Samir Khan's family too, and they had been repeatedly visited by the FBI, and the FBI told them that Samir Khan hadn't committed any crime, and they wanted to try to convince him to come, the family to get him to come home, but that he hadn't committed any crimes. A grand jury had been convened, they brought back no indictment against him. He was involved with propaganda activities. So he gets killed, and the reaction in the US basically fell into two camps: silence or enthusiastic support on Capitol Hill. Hillary Clinton praised it as a great victory, killing Anwar al-Awlaki and Samir Khan. Peter King, the Republican congressman, John McCain, Carl Levin. You can go back, you can play ping pong, Democrat, Republican, household name politicians, all saying this is great. One Republican congressman said that, well, if Samir Khan wasn't also a target, then it was a twofer. It was a bonus. He called it a twofer. And the only people that said anything about the killing of these American citizens, neither of whom had been charged with a crime or had any evidence publicly presented against him, neither of them had been indicted, their extradition had not been demanded because they hadn't been charged with anything. The only people that said anything were Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich, which is, totally, entirely predictable that those would be the two people that say anything in opposition to it on Capitol Hill. So after al-Awlaki gets killed, Abdul Rahman, the teenager that just turned 16, his grandmother calls him and says, Abdul Rahman, it's finished. Your father was killed and you can't see him. And she told me that Abdul Rahman was consoling her, that he was saying to her, you be strong. And for some reason that's really stuck with me. And I got to know who this kid is very well and sort of special person that he is. And I'll talk about that in a second. So they're saying, you have to come home. And he says, I will come home, but the roads are blocked. And the roads were blocked because there was an uprising in Yemen against the US-backed dictatorship as part of the Arab uprisings that were called in the media the Arab Spring. And the roads were blocked, and there was fighting, and there were people vying for little slices of territory, and there were drone bombings happening. And so he said, I have to lay low until the road's clear, so I'll stay with our family here until that happens. And so he's there in Shabwa with his family. And on the night of October 14th, 2011, he goes out for dinner with his cousin Ahmed, who's 17, and some of the younger people from their tribe, and they go to a makeshift restaurant to eat at about 9 o'clock. And while they're sitting there for dinner, a drone appears above them and launches a missile directly onto where they're eating and blows these kids up, blows them to pieces. And the next day, Dr. Nasser al-Awlaki, Anwar's father, Abdul Rahman's grandfather, the guy who's been raising this kid for years while his father's underground and was saving up money so that he could come to college in the United States, gets this call saying that they know that Abdul Rahman is dead. And the reason that they knew he was dead is because they found part of his skull. And if you look at a picture of this kid, he had an unusual haircut for Yemen. He had this huge afro, and his grandfather was always telling him to cut it, and his mother was always telling him to cut it, but it was sort of his teenage rebellion. He said, this is my trademark, and I want this head of hair. And they found that part of his head that had this unusual, huge mane on it. And so they knew that he was dead, but they couldn't separate whose body parts belonged to, they had to bury them in a mass grave. And so this family had just had their eldest son assassinated by his own government. And now 2 weeks later, to the day, their eldest grandson was killed in a US drone strike. And the response in the US was nothing short of shameful. A US military official leaked to the press that he was 21 years old. And they implied that he was an Al-Qaeda militant. So then the family produced, and I have a picture of it in my book, they produced his Colorado birth certificate showing that he was born in August of 1995 in Denver. And then they said, well, he was at an Al-Qaeda meeting. And then they said, well, he was meeting with this guy named Ibrahim al-Bana, who's a propagandist for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And then the CIA said, well, Ibrahim al-Bana's not on our hit list. And then to top that off, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula issues a statement saying Ibrahim al-Bana is still alive. And anyone who follows this knows that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or Al-Qaeda in general, is more reliable in saying when the number 3 guy gets killed than the US or the Washington Post. The number 2 guy in Al-Qaeda in Yemen has been killed, I think, 13 times in the past month. He was killed a week before releasing an audio tape where he referenced events that had happened after he was killed. So I trust them over the US government on who's alive and who's dead in the jihadi circles in Yemen. So who are they trying to kill if they kill this 16-year-old American citizen? I was Facebook friends with him, with Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki. This was a kid who was into hip-hop music, which I like because I'm also into hip-hop music, and I found it fascinating, that sort of half a world away, we liked some of the same music, and he was very much into comic books, and there were pictures and videos of him with his friends posing as rappers, and they liked to reenact scenes from these fight video games that they would play, and he was this wonderful, gentle, older sibling to his brothers and sisters, and he was a guy who was this quiet, goofy, lanky kid with a Facebook page and an obsession with comic books, and he, when the revolution broke out in Yemen, would go at night to hang out in Change Square with the nonviolent revolutionaries who were trying to bring down the US-backed dictatorship. And so when the family, who to this day somehow managed to muster up some admiration for the United States as a society, and I don't see how they do it after everything that they've lost, they thought certainly someone's going to explain to us that this is a terrible, terrible mistake, and they start asking questions. And no one will answer them. And then Senator Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, is on CNN with Candy Crowley, and she says to him, what about the 3 US citizens that have been killed in Yemen on operations ordered by President Obama? And Harry Reid says, well, I can't get into classified information, but I do know this. If there were 3 Americans that deserved to die, it was those 3. And I tried to get Harry Reid's office to clarify that position. And I wrote them and I called them and I said, how can you possibly mean that this 16-year-old kid deserved to die? What did he do to you? What did he do to us? What evidence do you have he had anything to do with this? And I was going after him on Twitter and because they weren't responding to anything. I was trying to shame them into saying something other than this kid deserved to die, and they never would respond to anything. And then Robert Gibbs, the former White House spokesperson, who was the surrogate for President Obama in the 2012 campaign, he would be the guy who would go and talk to reporters. He was asked about it by this young reporter named Sierra Adamson, and she said, this was a kid who was killed with no due process. Why did that happen? And he said, well, he should have had a more responsible father. You can find that video on YouTube and watch it for yourself if you want to be disgusted. I don't think there's anything, there are a few things more shameful that you can do in history, in human history, than blame the killing of children on who their parents are, or who their parents were, or what their last name is. And that was a statement not by someone who has no knowledge of how to talk to the press. This was the guy who was the press secretary for the president saying he should have had a more responsible father in response to someone saying, why did you guys kill a 16-year-old kid? And so I was pressing on this issue. I've been pressing on it. I'm still going to. I'm not going to stop until there's an explanation as to why this White House did this.